Hello?
Hey, Rich, it's Larson. You got a minute?
Sure, Larson, what's up?
Good morning and welcome to the Got a Minute podcast. It's me, Larson Hicks, and I'm joined by my co-host, Rich Lusk. And we're excited today to have Pastor Matt Patrick with us from the Well Church in Boulder. Welcome to the show, Matt. It's good to have you, man.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
Yeah. So there's been a big dust up in Matt's church out in Boulder. They've been members of Acts 29 for, I think, 14 years or so. Is that right, Matt?
Not quite that. Our church, almost that. Yeah, that's close. Roughly
Somewhere
that.
in that ballpark.
I've been around the network since 2007. We joined the network in 2011.
Okay, got it. Yeah, so they were they've got the distinguished honor now of being the second church since Mark Driscoll to be kicked out of Acts 29. So I think that calls for celebration at some level. So you guys can be proud of that.
Yeah, I didn't even write any famous books or have anybody ghostwrite for me or anything. We just just got the boot.
I heard a great story. I wish I could remember the exact details of it, but essentially, I used to live in Moscow, Idaho, and during my years there was just controversy after controversy. I mean, there was the city coming after the church. There were, people from outside of the community coming after the church. There were just all kinds of crazy things going on, and it just seemed like a constant struggle. And I think they had lived kind of in obscurity and kind of peace for like 20 years, and all of a sudden things just kind of blew up. But there was a story I heard, I think Doug Wilson tell of one day, after some latest slander coming out in some publication that Nancy came home with a bottle of scotch for Doug, and he said, "Well, what's this for?" And she said, "Well, we're celebrating. You've been reviled again. You've been slandered and reviled again, and so we need to celebrate." So anyway, I think
I'm a fan of that.
Yeah, right. Well, so I want to dive into this, and we kind of just want to hear your story about it, and my hope here is that that this is an opportunity for us. Rich and I are in the CREC, which is a small Reformed kind of Presbyterian denomination. Rich came out of the PCA, and he was kind of pushed out. We'll put it that way. But so he's kind of had a little bit of experience with this in a completely different context. But my hope is that the church can be edified through hearing your story. That people who are in Acts 29 or considering joining Acts 29 or considering leaving Acts 29 can kind of learn through hearing your experience. And so I'd love for you just to kind of dive in and maybe give us some background here about kind of what happened and how we got to this point where you guys got kicked out.
Yeah, you bet. Well, for us, I think it's important to say, one, we still at some level hold I would say a love for Acts 29 in our hearts. It was very important for me early on. I was a young pastor. I started far too young. I took over my first church when I was 22. I was a senior in college. And that terrible idea, by the way, don't ever do that. But I was just kind of felt like I was lost. I was in a small mountain town. I didn't know where to turn. I mean, I had books and I just was reading a lot and I didn't know what to do. And finding Acts 29 just kind of felt like I found a tribe, if you will, a group of people that were reformed. They were good preachers. Like they preached the word fiercely and intensely, and I loved that, and I was drawn to the masculine characteristics. I even say guys like Mark Driscoll brought that I thought were great. Obviously, he had some of his problems, and but the initial kind of go was this very strong. We plant churches, we advance the mission, we charge the gates of hell, all that kind of stuff. And as a young man, it was very attractive to me, and that still is. And I love that about it. And Acts 29 went through its iterations for sure. The big one being when Driscoll was removed and Matt Chandler became the president. That was a pretty big shakeup. But and then there were certain things. I remember in 2016, I believe there was a panel that was done where they had like Tabiti and Eric Mason and Brandon Washington and all these guys on stage, and it was just kind of one of these things where I was like, where are we going all of a sudden? And it seemed like the narrative wasn't about church planting anymore. It was about race and a lot of other things. And I remember just sitting back thinking, all right, I want to trust these guys. I want to believe in my leadership, and
Yeah.
we'll go for it. So our church even took a year and said, okay, maybe we're wrong here. Maybe we're not just seeing it right. We took a year and said, we're going to spend a year and study what does it mean to be a diverse church in our context. So we did all the listen and learn, right? Not all of it that you can ever do, but we read all the books we were supposed to.
Yeah.
And once we did that, we kind of arrived at some conclusions. We're like, I think we disagree with these guys a lot in these messages we're being told. And so that kind of left us in that camp, and we started feeling a little awkward around then. That's when that kind of started.
That was when was that? What year was that?
That was around 2016.
Okay. Wow. It's pretty early.
Yeah, and we weren't really pressing on anything. That was more internal. We really we're big believers at the Well. Chase, our other pastor, we have a co-pastor model, and we really felt led to be learners and be curious and study and we wanted to make the best decisions for our church and lead as well as we could. And so, we brought in speakers for conferences and tried to do all these things. And we just started questioning. Then when Steve Timmis was removed, that was another kind of big bump in the road. We're like, man, so now we've gone Driscoll, Timmis, it seems like...
Who is Steve Timmis for those who aren't familiar?
Yeah, Steve Timmis was based out of the UK.
Okay.
And he was, that's the funny thing, Acts 29, it's really hard to figure out what people's titles are because they change so much.
Yeah.
He was the president, and then at one point I believe he was the CEO.
Okay.
And even that title kind of got I was just like a little that's weird.
Why do we have a CEO?
why do we have a CEO of a church planting network? But I was like, I guess if they're organizing this global thing, maybe that makes sense, right?
Yeah.
Still trying to believe. But then when he got ousted, and the timing of that was odd, and I don't know the ins and outs in that. I'm not big enough to know, and I wasn't in some big leadership position. But, it happened right on the heels of a Christianity Today article that came out saying that he was an abusive leader. And all my interactions with him were positive. I have some friends that said some were negative, and so I'm not here to defend or go against Steve Timmis or anything like that. But the whole thing seemed odd. It was just strange. And so I think what you saw over time was a slow erosion of trust. And that came when Chase, particularly our other pastor, pressed on them and talked to some leaders and said, hey, what happened here? And they were like, well, he was an abusive leader. And he was like, well, what does that mean? And nobody would really tell us what that meant.
Yeah.
And it was like, well, was there an investigation of any sort?
Right.
Like, well, we're not going to share that with you. And we're like, well, Steve told us we could ask. So he's open to it. So what happened? We're not going to tell you. That's internal stuff. Okay. Well, what's abusive leadership? Well, abusive leadership, I believe the words that were used were anybody that uses their position of power against others, essentially is what was said. And we were just like, well, that could be a lot of things. I have definitely been an abusive leader. That's going to get clipped and put on YouTube somewhere. Matt Patrick admits he's an abusive leader.
Definitely.
But
it's okay. So is Jesus.
Yeah, right. I'll roll with him. And so that was odd, that whole experience. And so all of this is going on. 2020 hits, and the world goes nuts. And we're in Boulder, Colorado, which isn't any different than a lot of the Western places, but it's intensely liberal. I mean, our streets are painted with rainbows, and quite literally, and to be what would be considered conservative at any level or orthodox in Christianity would be odd. We always joke about our church. We're trying to be the most normal church in Boulder, and it's not that hard. And we just want to be the most plain, simple, basic Christian church that loves God and is
Yeah.
clear on its theological convictions. And
Yeah.
that's not a complex thing. There are other great churches in Boulder, by the way.
Yeah.
But so we're sitting here and we're watching our city shut down and BLM in the streets and all of these things just going on. And we're looking to our leadership for some answers. What do we do?
Mm.
What's our stance? What are we saying? Because it seems like we write a position paper or make a statement every time something happens, but we're all of a sudden silent.
Yeah.
And I the way I took it was Chase, our other pastor. He's more prolific online than I am. He's a great writer. He's written a book and all that stuff. And that's not me.
Yeah.
I'm more of a face to face. And so over time, the kind of conversations with Chase online, just kind of asking these questions and pressing and writing on his blog, and me kind of pressing some leadership and asking hard questions, we started to feel as though we were just annoying everybody.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we're saying, like, I remember I posted Acts 29 has like its own private like chat, like workplace kind of thing. At that
Sure.
time, it was run by Facebook. And I remember I posted just kind of jokingly because I always viewed Acts 29 as a place where you could kind of throw out hard stuff and we could fight like
Yeah.
men.
Yeah.
And if you disagreed, that's fine. And I just said, does anybody else feel like they're going to completely lose it if they ever have to put a mask on again? Because I wasn't wearing one at that point, and our church had regathered.
Right.
And I mean, I got just slammed on there. Like guys were just coming out of the woodwork, just hitting me left and right. Like my wife's a nurse, and people are dying, and how dare you? And I
Wow.
was like, what is happening to our network here? We can't even. It was just overly personal and strange, and the leadership just stayed quiet.
Hmm.
And there was just this kind of infighting that I felt started. And granted, I probably threw the first punch by playing around, and I can
Yeah.
own that. And I didn't know it'd go that way. And then just pressing on the race issues and what are we doing here? It just kind of boom, just that was 2020 through now. That was really where it started going pretty haywire, I would say. And I mean, even we were having network leaders and VPs hitting us up at weird hours of the night because we would Chase wrote a critique of Russell Moore at one point.
Yeah.
And it's basically, how dare you do this? We're like, he's not even in our network. He's a
Yeah.
thought leader. Thought leaders can be challenged,
Right.
right? And
What
question.
what does Acts 29 as an organization? I'm just curious. You've referred to them as your leaders a bunch of times. I mean, how do they think of themselves in relation to the churches? Like in the Anglican church, you have a very clear sort of org chart kind of structure, and in the Presbyterian church, it's different, but it's still clear. Like we have pastors and elders, we have presbyteries, which are bodies. You have presiding ministers of these presbyteries, and so the authority structure is pretty well defined. How is that? How does Acts 29 kind of communicate what is their relationship to individual churches and pastors?
Yeah, it's a great question. That was one of the things we started asking around. We started asking for things like the bylaws because we didn't understand that exactly. We were curious as to what is our relationship with the network. And so, like in our church, if you become a member, you sign a membership covenant.
Okay.
And after you go through the membership process, you're interviewed by an elder, all those sorts of things.
Right.
We're Baptistic. Have you been baptized? These sorts of things. And in our covenant, we would say it's kind of a two-way street. It's our commitment to you as a church and your commitment to your local church.
Yeah.
What we started noticing was Acts 29, it's really just our commitment to Acts 29 financially. And a commitment to be, they would say things reformed, and they're soteriology. Like that was about where that kind of stopped when we kind of dug into it.
Yeah.
They did say for a long time complementarian, and I think they would still say that, but they've removed their position paper on that, which
really?
that was another speed bump for us. But then we had an Acts 29 church with a woman preaching. So we were like, well, that's odd. So are we that? And then And then we were like, well, what is your authority? And it's like, well, we really don't exercise any authority over local churches. It's more like the SBC where you're autonomous,
Mm,
as long as you participate, is what it felt like.
right, right. That's interesting. Yeah, I've heard we do a new members class, and one of the talks, one of the topics in the class is what is a denomination, and what does it mean to be in a denomination versus non-denominational churches. And Jason Cherry, who's one of our elders, he used to be a preacher in Acts 29, and he defines it as, he's like, the word denomination means to name, to name. And so a denomination is a group of people or a group of churches who are willing to name what it is they believe. And a non-denomination church is just a church that is not willing to name what they believe. At least, that's kind of a broad strokes. And so it's not that either church or organization doesn't have beliefs. It's just that one group is saying, hey, we're going to put them right out here in the public, where the other is saying, well, we're going to kind of stuff them in the show. That's a generalization, but
Yeah.
with the network, it sounds like they've been pretty, it sounds like they've had positions, but they've quietly removed those positions, and they are kind of keeping their cards close to their vest in terms of what it is as a network that they're really committed to theologically. Would that be fair?
No, that's fair. And we felt that tension. I believe it was around 2017. We actually started a thing called the Well Collaborative, where we plant churches out of it.
Yeah.
But in that, what we began to do is we said, the truth is, in a non-denominational church, the senior pastor or pastors, in our case, really do run the church. And any sort of authority is kind of imaginary. I hate that was us. And so
Yeah.
I feel safe saying that, because our elders, as great as they are, they're not here full time, and
Yeah.
they're mostly lay guys. And if there's a big theological debate that's going to come up or something like that, I mean, Chase is working on his PhD right now. I've got a master's. We're probably going to win that argument,
Right.
even if we're wrong. And
Right.
so we actually set up our own. We kind of stole from the Presbyterians. We looked at them. We're like, well, I think they probably actually have one of the best structures out there for accountability. And we created, in a sense, our own oversight board with external pastors that can fire us. And we built that out because we felt like we couldn't get that from our network. And we realized
cool.
that I don't think that's what the network ever intended to be.
Sure.
They would say, we plant churches that plant churches. We are a diverse global family of church planting churches.
Yeah.
And so we're here to plant churches. That's what we're here to do, to help you do that. And so maybe we had some misgivings that isn't necessarily their fault about that sort of thing.
Yeah. I mean, is there any sort of commitment to quality churches, like good churches? Would they add the adjective, like, we're here to plant good churches, or just any old church will do?
I would say that it must be missionally innovative. It would be the term that they would use. And that's the thing. A lot of it's ambiguous. But this isn't, this is a broad statement. But what we started noticing, there was a time when they wanted to kind of redo the assessment thing. And Chase and I wrote up a whole entire, hey, here's how we can plant churches. We've been, the Lord's blessed us a lot in church planting, particularly here in Colorado. We're about ready to launch out our 5th church that we've launched in total in the state. One of them is no longer a church that they shut down during COVID and due to a lot of reasons. But, we've been fairly successful there. So we're like, hey, we have a lot to offer. And in that process, we kind of realized that it was, we were kind of just planting the same thing over and over again. It was kind of hipster, craft coffee, scarves, things that it was just a heads up to me. I was like, man, our network's changed. We used to kind of be a bunch of like biker guys.
Yeah.
And now we're not that. And even though we were trying to be this diverse thing, it kind of all seemed to be the same kind of, we're really cool is what it felt like we were trying to be. And I sense the leadership didn't want that, but that's what they were letting in.
So
Yeah.
Matt, yeah, how did that happen? Because obviously, Acts 29 is not the only organization that's gone through that kind of transformation in recent years. There's been a lot of changes, say in the SBC. You mentioned sort of the downplaying of complementarianism. I think you've seen that in several denominations where there's kind of this, even in denominations that don't want to fully embrace, say, egalitarianism, they're you could say maybe moving that direction. You mentioned, obviously the diversity, critical race theory, things like that. We've seen those kind of things platformed or just infiltrate different denominations. And one thing that I'm interested in, I mean, we're in the Series C. The Series C has, I think, to this point, successfully repelled those kinds of movements. I haven't seen any CRT or sort of encroaching feminism in the in the Series C, which is not to say that we're immune to those kind of things, and it's not to say we don't have other, issues to deal with, obviously. But those are kind of the things that you see in the culture that then are becoming, I think, mirrored in some way in the church. It's interesting to me, how convenient it is that, Rick Warren changes his mind on women's ordination right about the time that the pressure from the feminists and the broader culture is really ratcheting up, and then he says, well, it's not the culture that made me change my mind on this, which I'm like,
Yeah.
I'm not so sure about that. But I'm curious, since you're an insider to this, and it might be something that would be helpful, even for people who are not in Acts 29, who have to deal with some of the same kinds of trends or influences that they see, coming in, or that they're having to deal with. How do you think? How did that change happen? And is there a trajectory here? Where is Acts 29? Where's it headed? Is there a destination or an endpoint?
Yeah, that's a great question. What I would say to that is there was, let me put it this way. I think Aaron Wren has actually done some great work on the kind of three ways of thinking through culture, the positive, the neutral, the negative. I believe Acts 29 made a deep commitment to the neutral worldview. Very Keller-esque, which had its time and its day, absolutely. And it was this kind of thing of we won't be culture warriors. We're not going to fight these huge battles and do that sort of thing. And what happened over time is that just kind of took the edge off, right? Like we weren't a serrated, like the goal is to not be the serrated edge anymore, but be a clean cut, be very precise, not political, not any of these things. And over time, what happened was those of us that are in context where it's like, we do not have an option about fighting these things, right? We must speak on these things, that these are our people are going to work. I mean, in our church, we have an African-American man from Kenya who was fired from his job in Boulder because he didn't want to participate in DEI training.
Because obviously he knows nothing about diversity and needs to be educated in it.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a member in my church, and he's coming to me saying, "What do I do? I just lost my job." So we're saying, "Hey, these methods in which you're putting out for us to follow just don't work for us in our context." And they were relentlessly committed to it, and I think of it as very Ed Stetzer, Russell Moore, that kind of tribe of thinking. And so, and it was kind of, I would say, covered in this thing of we're being grown-ups now. We used to, when Driscoll ran it, we were kids. We fought and we used intense language and all of these sorts of things. And now we're going to be more grown-up, and we're going to be, the way I interpreted it was, we're going to be more like a business that will run well and makes good money and is just kind of a neutral place for churches to exist. A lot of what we were told was we don't get into orthopraxy, or every church has its own contextual thing to figure out. And so if we make a statement really hard on something, then, maybe that won't work for all of the churches. And we were just kind of throwing up our hands going, well, it doesn't work for us at all, And so I think that's how it got there, was this deep commitment to these things. And to be 100% straight, these things are all connected. I mean, there's whether it's the Acts 29 having a partnership with the Gospel Coalition, bringing in Russell Moore to be the main speaker at our national conference, and a lot of outside kind of networks. And it almost seems like it's like, man, it's really hard to keep getting book deals for our main people. It's really hard to keep doing the big conferences and doing these big things if we speak up or if we have a really strong stand. And so it just kind of degraded into what it is now. And a lot of guys are very frustrated. You know, for us, people are like, well, why didn't you just quit Acts 29?
Yeah.
You know, while we were in Acts 29, we actually went to a CREC presbytery up in Washington just to view it. And it was wild because we had just left the West Conference for Acts 29. And we were there, and it's a big conference. And, you know, we had women teaching at it, and it was just this big hurrah kind of thing. Brian Howard put on the Acts 29 hat with the thing on and said, it's like putting on your favorite team's hat. Do you support the brand kind of thing? And we just kind of were like, this is really odd. This whole thing's really strange. And then we go to the CREC Presbytery, and it's just like, open your hymnals to page 454. Start singing. Okay, let's fight about a few things. Okay, let's go get some food. I was like, this is great. You know, and then Acts 29 ends with, by the way, you know, we're short on budget. We really need you to give. But the good news is our lead pastors and wives retreat is in Cancun this year. They announced that. And I was just like, what is happening?
Yeah.
And they announced that after a $2 million budget shortfall. I'm like, what are we doing here, guys?
That's
and
wild.
so
the CREC did its last council meeting in Monroe, Louisiana. Not exactly Cancun.
The illustrious, the tourist trap of Monroe, Louisiana. That's right.
But hey, they didn't require masks anywhere.
That's right.
That's where I want to go.
It seems. I mean, I'm not saying this to try to sound disparaging. I'm honestly just trying to kind of wrestle with understanding what Acts 29 is. I mean, it sounds to me like it's a brand, you know, essentially it's a brand that churches pay to put on their website, so that they can be more than a non-denominational church. I mean, it sounds like there is, especially if you're young, there's some training and some, you use the term assessment. I assume that's evaluating whether somebody should be planting a church. I'm curious how rigorous that is. I'm curious. You talked about how you planted when you were probably way too young and too immature to do it. You know, it's kind of like, it makes me wonder if there's a incentive for the brand to keep people out or to shut down pastors who are teaching heresy or are who are truly harming their congregations. I know that Mark Driscoll was harming the brand, perhaps, but it seems like that's more what's going on. That it's a brand that is trying to maintain their, you know, they're collecting high profile kind of big Eva names to associate with their brand so that the brand itself has more cachet, and the actual work of, you know, discipling individuals, you know, and the training of and the disciplining of the pastors and holding accountable of the pastors that are doing that work is sort of that's not really part of the mission, it seems like, of the organization almost.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. To put the logo on your website used to really mean something. It helped our church grow.
Yeah,
it really did early on. I don't think anybody cares anymore or really knows. It's kind of faded into a little bit more obscurity. For better or for worse, Driscoll did something out there, and in a city like ours where people live here on an average 3.5 years, it's also a lot of people moving in. And so that website, to be able to go to it and look up a church and go, I'm going to get solid preaching. I'm going to be able to, I know it's Reformed. I know it's complementarian. It's going to be somewhat similar to what I was in before.
Yeah.
That used to matter. I don't think that matters nearly as much anymore. The assessment process has gone through many iterations. I don't know what it's like in depth now. I actually was part of an assessment team and removed myself from participating in it because I thought it was too vague. It was a weekend we'd spend with a husband and a wife, and the metrics we were using really just seemed to be kind of more up to the assessors that were there than this is what we're truly looking for. Now, I know actually I'd say, hey, we give you like a form that you go through, but it could very much be like, well, I don't like this guy or I do like this guy. That's kind of what it felt like. And I was just like, man, this is really hard to get a feel on this man, his theology, his missional posture towards culture, how he's going to implement anything, what his plan is to plant a church and care for people and shepherd them. It's really hard to get through it in just a couple of days. And I think they're trying their best in that area. But that's why when we started the Well Collaborative, we have our own assessment process, which it takes people about a year to 2 years to get through. And by that time, we have a pretty good feeling of who they are. And then we'd put them through assessment in Acts 29, and they would show up and they would pass because we'd basically be able to say, this guy's good to go. So we kind of created our own thing because we felt a lack there of that. When Acts 29 started, I mean, we never received funds from Acts 29. They do have a funding arm now. And I believe you can get $25,000 once you get to 40 people and another 25 once you get to 50. I think there's something interesting in there. I'm not 100% sure on it, so I won't really bring it up on paying it back, but it's interesting for that. So they've added that funding kind of arm as of late to churches that do kind of get some traction.
Interesting. Well, I think, just from the sake of kind of the goal I sort of talked about at the top of the call of having this be edifying. I mean, I think two interesting areas to discuss are A, kind of where do you see the trajectory of Acts 29, and B, well, there's maybe three questions, and we can kind of tackle these in whatever order you want. But what's the trajectory of Acts 29 currently as you see it? What should have you seen people? You guys were kicked out. Have you seen others who have handled their concerns, deal with it in a way that's been more productive, or healthier? I mean, do you see a path forward there? So I'll stop there. Those are two questions I think would be helpful to kind of dive a little deeper into.
Yeah. To set that up for us, we stayed because we thought we could reform the network a little bit.
Yeah.
And we'd already invested over $100,000 in the network, and what we'd given to it. And I still have great relationships. I'm in a text group with a bunch of Acts 29 pastors that's way too busy. I actually had to put it like on the silent mode, and I only check it once a day,
Yeah.
And it's sad though to see that group. I think there's only one or two guys left in it who are still in the network, who most of them have left.
Interesting. Yeah.
And over time, what's happening is guys, because they're not getting answers, we started pressing around things like, can we see a budget? And the answer was no. And can we see the bylaws? The answer was no. Those are private internal documents, which is a silly move because that's a publicly listed thing that you can find on the state of California's website. So we just found it, and here you go. So guys have been leaving. Coram Deo up in the Northwest, led by John Needham, he left, and he wrote a very good letter that he publicly put out. And so Justin Buzzard in California, he left recently. He posted a letter as well. We wrote a letter on our website. It was a little shorter and more succinct than those ones. But guys are starting to press, and they want some answers into these things. And in Acts 29, we signed up for it, what it is. And what it is it is a governing body in a sense that can do what it wants. It can appoint who it wants to the board. It can remove who it wants from the board. It can remove churches unilaterally, like they did with us.
Yeah.
And so my encouragement for guys is if you want to be part of something like that, you just need to make up your mind and knowing that that's what you're going to be part of.
Yeah.
As far as the future, I think it would be presumptuous to say that Acts 29 won't survive.
Yeah.
I think that would be taking it too far, but I think it's going to look very different going into the future than it has been in the past. A lot of churches are leaving. I know many are giving this year kind of a runway to go, let's see what happens.
Yeah.
Kind of thing, because same reasons as us, that they love the network and they want it to go. But I know of lots of men. There's a whole entire chunk of Texas recently that has left the network. And I'm fielding, I don't think I'd be exaggerating to say 20 to 40 phone calls or emails a month from A29 guys asking what they should do.
Wow.
And so that's concerning. That was happening when we were still in the network. And just to be very clear, we encouraged guys not to quit at that time.
Yeah.
We said stay, what we're working on. We even hosted our own event at an Acts 29 event full of disgruntled A29 pastors, and encourage them that, like, hey, these are hard times. We fight. We're not quitters. Since then, being kicked out, it's hard for me to encourage guys to stay in the network with the leadership in the direction that it's going.
The lack of transparency that you described there, it seems to me, would be a red flag for any organization.
Yeah.
But especially a Christian denomination where you would expect everything to be above board. You would expect accountability, and it doesn't sound like any of that has really been in place. So that's obviously a problem. It seems to me, though, that what really led to the friction with you guys, from what I've gathered, and I'm not familiar with these other pastors you mentioned that have left, but it sounds like just the overall direction of Acts 29 towards wokeness, progressivism, whatever label you want to put on it, seems like that's the direction it's going, which again is you've seen the same kinds of influences make inroads in other denominations and Christian organizations. You mentioned the connection with the Gospel Coalition. I mean, that's another where you can kind of trace out the shift. You can kind of see the shift that's taken place in Gospel Coalition over the years. So, I mean, any lessons specifically from that? Just what you've observed. You made reference to Aaron Wren's assessment of how we have moved from positive world where it was a benefit socially and culturally to be a Christian at an earlier point in American history, to neutral world where it really didn't matter that much one way or the other, to now negative world where in a lot of our country, and certainly where you are, maybe you could say most of the country, it's actually a negative to be a Christian. It's going to get you labeled as a bigot or hater or whatever other label they want to put on you. And often this has to do with our stance on sexual ethics, or other things related to that. You guys are out of the network now. What lessons are you walking away with?
Yeah.
The main lesson that I would say is history is important. And this is why I think denominations can be good things, is they have a historicity to them. They're tied to something they're tied to a creed, or they're tied to a confession, right? And these things really do matter, and they guide the governing practices of the organization. We're not just making it up as we go.
Yeah.
So, for our church, taking our elders through the London Baptist Confession and considering adopting it. And so I'm thankful to Acts 29 for that it's forced us to kind of repent of our genericness, if you will, and go, we need to be clear here. And I would encourage church planters to really think through these things. What do you want to be part of, and why? What is the motivation there? Is it financial? Is it brotherhood? Is it Or is it, hey, these are men I can lock arms with, and we can plant churches that we know survive the cultural waves that come with us and will hold us accountable to those things? Those things have become more and more important to us. And the combination of what happened with us in Acts 29 and what's happening culturally I think it's forcing a lot of churches to really think about that. Because if you're just going to roll with whatever comes your way, you're just going to get swallowed up. There is no winning here if you just kind of roll with the culture, because they'll come after you. I mean, we just saw that with the Gospel Coalition, and I believe it was Josh Butler's article, and he wrote his book, and how he got canceled by the Gospel Coalition and the Keller Institute over. I mean, it was a weird article, right? Like the wording was goofy. The premise was fine, I guess, like that kind of thing. But to watch those men abandon that guy so quickly, I want nothing to do with anything like that. I want men that are loyal first to King Jesus and then understand what it means to support a brother. Yeah, I mean, somebody should hold Gospel Coalition accountable to that, right? Like, you need better editors, right? Like a better editor that was doing that there would be helpful. And so I see that kind of culture in Acts 29, where it's like we have to remove guys that could be problematic for us instead of working with them, correcting them, rebuking them, so on and so forth.
Well,
And
the Josh Butler thing was interesting. I actually didn't even get to read the article; it got taken down so fast. But then, of course, I kind of saw in the aftermath some comments about it, some excerpts of it, and yeah, there was definitely some very poorly chosen wording. He would probably be the first to admit that. Some of the language not so great, but the concept itself of sex as an icon of the relationship of Christ and the church, I think that's what he was getting at, as best I could make out from what I did read. That's something that Christians have believed, for as far back as you can go. And marriage obviously created as an icon of Christ in the church, but the sexual relationship, the sexual oneness, that's the heart of marriage, is really the pinnacle of that symbolism of Christ's union with the church. So the gospel has there's a kind of sexual symbolism of the gospel implied in all that. And I get the sense, again, without having read the article, that's what he was getting at. But it was interesting. It seems like the article offended some women, and that's what kind of, then it just cascaded from there to, this guy's got to be completely canceled, and he's immediately off of the whatever the Keller Center for Culture, whatever that's called. He just gets the axe completely. And obviously that to me seemed like it was very unfair to him. I know next to nothing about him, but that to me seemed very unfair. But I think it's representative of the larger problem that really you're getting at, Matt, and maybe that you've experienced with Gospel Coalition and that we've seen happen. And that is simply a failure of nerve on the part of Christian men, particularly Christian pastors, just a failure of nerve, a kind of cowardice, an unwillingness to stand up, to take heat for something, to hold ground, to defend our own, and even to defend truth when it's under attack. Why not say, hey, Josh, go rewrite your article and let's trot it back out there. Why not continue to work with him and all of that? Why cancel him just because the mob demands it? To me, that was a huge mistake. And basically, when you do that, what you do is you show people, look, you can have your way with us. You can get us to do anything you want us to do. All you have to do is push back hard enough. If you demand an apology or you demand somebody get canceled, we're going to cave and do it because we don't have the guts to stand up to you. And I kind of get the sense that that's what happened there. And of course, that's happened in other cases too. But that, again, from my vantage point, without knowing all the facts, but from what I could see, that's what it looked like. And of course, that's very, very scary. You do need a band of brothers that will stand with you, men of courage and conviction who are not going to run, the first time a shot is fired. It looks to me like Acts 29 can't be counted on that kind of, for that any more than the Gospel Coalition can be.
Yeah.
That's what it looks like to me.
And I would just add to that, the process that you find, whether it be in something like the CRUC or in some Presbyterian denominations, I'd like to say as a Baptist myself, some Baptist denominations as well, there's a process for removal.
Yeah.
There's a way that it's done, and you can know what it is. And I'm not claiming victimhood here. We knew what we were doing the whole time, right?
Right.
Like what we were pressing. So don't hear me saying like, woe is us, this terrible thing happened to us. At the end of the day, it saves us money, and we get to invest it more in our church planting efforts here. So I'm saddened by the loss of relationship, but that's kind of where that ends. I'm not losing sleep or anything like that, but the process that's there, and you see this where, for us, when we got our call, we were given 1 hour to hop on a Zoom call, and we get on, and it's just, hey, because you have publicly critiqued the network, we are unilaterally removing you effective immediately. Those were like the first lines of the phone call. And we're just like, well, what did we do? And they're like, well, you constant public critique. And that just wasn't true. And we did not we were very intentional to not do that. We had a lot of internal dialogue with a lot of men. We brought up our concerns. We did not post stuff publicly. And when we asked repeatedly for proof, it was just like, you just did it. And we're like, did what? And they're like, well, you know what you did. I'm like, no, tell me. Did we sin? No, you did not sin. At one point in the call, one of the VPs on the call said, you guys aren't evil, you're not satanic, and you didn't sin. And I said, well, thanks for that. But what did we do?
Yeah.
And eventually just like, well, you're just not a good fit.
Yeah.
And that's fair. People cannot be a good fit for things, but there should be conversations around that, leading to that, and saying, hey, this is the process for it. So when I think of networks or denominations, what is the process for somebody to be A, put into a leadership position, or B, to be removed? What does that even look like? Those are answers that I think guys should have. And my encouragement to Acts 29 would be to clarify that process going forward, or they're going to have a lot of hurt guys who are very confused as to how things happen and why they're being removed.
Even in I'm a CEO of a company, and just from a corporate legal human resources standpoint, I can't just fire somebody. I can, and I'm in Alabama, which is a right to work state, so it's easier for me to fire somebody. But even just from a bare sort of legal standpoint, you really need to communicate and document that you have communicated a concern and that you've given the employee an opportunity to fix the issue. And there needs to typically be a documented recurring pattern of failure to meet, expectations before you can fire somebody. And in a lot of places, if you don't do that, you are liable for a big fat lawsuit. My company has been involved in these kinds of lawsuits. So I mean, of course there's Matthew 18, which as Christians, Christ has given us a pattern for how we deal with sin, and I think the principles can be applied to even non-sin, to disagreements and problems, but the world, the corporate world even understands this. I wonder if, it would be very sad to see any lawsuits come out of this kind of thing. But I mean, that certainly seems like something they could leave. If having the brand of Acts 29 on your church really is important for driving, membership and has a real financial implication on your church, I mean, what's to stop a church that gets kicked out from suing, and saying, hey, this is wrongful termination, essentially?
Yeah. I believe I could be wrong, but I believe their bylaws do state that they can do that.
Yeah.
And you sign up for that. They are incorporated as a church, Acts 29, which is actually, as a businessman myself, I own some businesses, actually a pretty savvy move in the sense that you get left alone on a lot of things when you're incorporated as a church. They're not just a standard 501c3 nonprofit. That they're incorporated as a church, and so that gives them some flexibility in what they can do.
Interesting. Matt, you talked about in the early days when you were attracted to Acts 29 that part of it was Reformed, complementarian, masculine in the sense that you've got guys like Mark Driscoll who are willing to engage with the culture and not pull any punches. That was the brand at the time that you were intrigued and drawn to it. And you've talked about how you started getting this like CRT training back in 2016 and things that's definitely sounded like it was leading in a different direction. I saw my own, it's interesting. We planted this church here in Huntsville less than 3 years ago. And prior to the CREC, I actually went to an Acts 29 church locally and said, hey, we're trying to plant this church. We're looking for accountability. We're looking for support, not financially, just biblical accountability and support from other churches locally. We want this to be a work of the Huntsville church. Would you guys consider, partnering with us? And they said, well, lay out your distinctives. And so I sat down in an office with a bunch of Acts 29 leaders and laid out the distinctives, and they didn't really like them. The specific, they were concerned that I didn't talk enough about evangelism, which I explained. And then there was one line of questioning where I was just talking about things that could happen as a church. And one of the comments I made was I could see us having a deacons fund. I talked about one of our distinctives is keeping our kids. Like we're seeing in the culture that our kids that a lot of churches are doing a great job of converting people, but there's just as many going out the back door as there are coming in the front door, in the form of churches of kids leaving the faith. And in the South, every single atheist I've ever met in the South grew up in the church. So I'm kind of saying, hey, this is a deficiency I see in the local church. I want to focus on discipling our kids and keeping our kids in the faith. And I said, I could see one example of how we do that, being that we have like a deacons fund for, let's say, a single mom who wants to put her kids and needs to work, but wants to put her kids in a Christian school. We'd love to help support that mom. Mm-hmm. And one of the guys in the room was like upset by that comment. He just said, well, I don't even know what to do with that comment. Like, what are you saying? You're saying that Christians' kids should be in Christian schools? And what's wrong with public school? And I was like, oh, is this a controversial, like, what do you, anyway, I saw that recently Jen Wilkin, who I know is like pretty prominent in the Acts 29 world, that she's out there talking about the benefits of putting your kids in public school. Does that say anything about the trajectory, of where Acts 29 is going as opposed to where it was when you first kind of came to it?
I think that's probably been there the whole time. And to be fair, I probably thought that way for a long time myself.
Yeah.
And what I've realized over time is so for full disclosure, two of my children are still currently in a school here in Boulder. It's a charter school, and my sister is a teacher at it, and we're best friends with all the teachers. And it's a block from our house, and we know, but I met with the principal one time, and I even said, listen, like, I need to know what's going on here. I'm pulling my kids, and they're like, no, we're not doing that kind of thing. And I said, yeah, because I want my kids to be in the world a little bit, but I'm not going to sacrifice them to the God of mission, so that you can experiment with some weird, DEI stuff or transgender stuff. And so I think I was there. Since then, we're moving our kids out of all of these systems, and so for us, I would say that, like, when I look at the network, I think that's its posture, is it's evangelism, which I love evangelism. I think I have that gifting, as I hope most Christians do. But it's almost to the detriment of the church and how we think. And that's the danger in Acts 29, is that my people, because I supported things like Jen Wilkin and the Gospel Coalition and books written by guys in 829, they're taking that information, and then when we say in our church, hey, we think this is wrong, they go, no, but these big Eva guys say this is right.
Right.
And that's the real danger. And so I think what churches are seeing, the reason that matters is churches that are kind of waking up, that they've kind of entered the matrix and they can kind of see it, for what it is.
Yeah.
That now they're having these internal wars with their own people as they're going, this is bad. And they're looking at their network, and their network is supporting the things that's making their life hell in their church as
Right.
they're fighting against it. And that's a big
Right.
issue. And the family's a huge one. I don't know how you could send your child currently to a school that, like Boulder Valley Public Schools, has the gender unicorn that comes in and teaches kids how to pick their gender in elementary school.
Unreal.
Like I don't know how we can go. I can't believe you'd want to put your kid in a Christian school, and I'm like, I can't believe that you would be okay with that. I don't understand, and
Yeah.
so I think that that's a real seismic shift that's happening within the network where guys are
Yeah.
coming awake to that. But some of them are so committed, and it's sad to this missional and everything. You'll hear them talk about it. It's like, if I went to a foreign country, I would dress like the people and eat their food. I'm like, yeah, but you also wouldn't like submit your kids to being trained in whatever witchcraft was going on in the society.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a
Yeah,
great
we're
point.
like sacrifice.
Yeah,
It's like we're
and
witnessing to
just
the pagan, the pagans who offer their kids up to idols. Like, well, yeah, we'll just do that too.
yeah,
Yeah.
that is where it really takes discernment to know,
Yeah.
where should those lines be drawn? What kinds of things in the culture can we participate in, and what kind of things must we distance ourselves from? Because in a Christian in any cultural context, it's always going to be both. But I have reasons for favoring Christian education that go way beyond just
Absolutely.
the gender unicorn being used at the public school. One thing that struck me, and I've not listened to the whole debate that Jen Wilkin had with was it John Pennington? Is that who did it? Jonathan Pennington was the
I believe so.
debate partner, I think.
Sounds right.
It was interesting to me. Her approach to that question was all about the community, and obviously, Jeremiah 29. I mean, we should seek the good of the city where we live. I think the best way to do that is not to send your kids to public school, but to produce faithful Christian kids who grow into mature Christian adults who can, serve God, serve neighbor, serve the kingdom of God that way. And for me, like if you ask, okay, what's the best way to get there? Public school's not it. But what was interesting to me is that her focus was entirely on the good of the community. And again, I've not listened to every minute of the debate yet. I still need to finish it. But I did not see her interact at all with those passages in the Bible that actually talk about parents and their obligations, their responsibilities to their children. So she talked about a responsibility to the wider community, Jeremiah 29 kind of thing, but did not talk about those passages like, say, Deuteronomy 6 or Ephesians 6 that talk specifically about parents' responsibility to disciple their children and to disciple their children comprehensively. So there was no
Right.
sense in which she, seems to understand that religion, that all education is inherently and intrinsically religious in nature. And if Jesus is not the Lord of the curriculum, if Jesus is not the Lord of the classroom, then some other idol is being served there. And if students become like their teachers, then that raises a lot of questions. Again, I think the other aspect of her argument was kind of a pragmatic one. Basically, it worked for my kids. My kids got a great education. And there was that element to it. And I don't doubt that that's true. I mean, she probably lives in a pretty wealthy and fairly conservative school district where the education probably is pretty good and where
Right.
some of the worst stuff is probably not present. But I think that still misses the point of the argument for Christian education. It just doesn't deal with what those passages like Deuteronomy 6 and Ephesians 6 tell parents to do with their children. So, and that to me is going to become a more pressing issue. It seems to me that a lot of people are still thinking in kind of positive world or neutral world terms about that kind of question. Oh, the public schools are our schools, and so our kids can go there, and we can sort of all even though we've got this sort of pluralistic, or we might say polytheistic society, we can all have our kids educated together. Well, no, there is a God. There is a God at work there. There's a God that's being honored. It's just not the God of the Bible that's being honored there. That's one thing that stands out to me. And one issue that I think Christians are going to have to make decisions about. We're in the Series C. We've emphasized Christian education for a long time. And again, totally apart from, things like, gender identity, gender ideology being taught in the schools, totally apart from that, long before that arose. But I think now that those kind of things are happening, you're going to have more and more Christians who do have to rethink their relationship to the public school, and in doing so will really be rethinking their relationship to the wider culture. And they're going to realize they're going to have to come to the realization that the culture at large is much more antagonistic to me and to my faith, and so I need to brace myself for that. I need to be ready for impact. You cannot be engaged in this culture as a Christian today without being on a collision course in all kinds of ways with what's happening in the
Mm.
culture. And a lot of Christians are just not ready for that kind of crash into the culture, that kind of head-on collision. One other thing, and this kind of backtracks in our discussion, but this stood out to me, and I know we're kind of getting to the end of our time here, but man, it sounds like you need to go start an Acts 30 network. Is that what's next? Acts 30. But it's interesting to me. I mean, a lot of
Yeah,
these
that name.
questions kind of come down to how the church should be organized, how churches should be planted. And I get the desire to create. I mean, I would consider something like Acts 29 to
Mhm.
basically be sort of a parachurch model. I know legally they sort of have represented themselves as a
Exactly.
church, but it seems to be really more of a parachurch model, and it
Yeah.
was done largely for reasons of efficiency. They don't have to deal with any red tape that you might have in a denomination. Uh, they really don't have to deal with a lot of accountability. They don't
Right.
have to be very transparent about a lot of things. They can collect funds and disperse those funds as they see fit. And if people start to ask really hard questions, like you guys were doing about direction, trajectory, and so forth, then they can just kick you out, basically without any kind of recourse. It doesn't sound like there's any kind of court of appeals or anything like that. I mean, the kind of things that you would have in a more, say traditional Presbyterian or just most any polity would have some kind of recourse in terms of appeals, an appeals process or something like that, that it seems like you don't have. But so there's two things that I think stand out to me, and these are things that are good, Larson, for us in the Series C, good for us to think about, and I think any Christians who are interested in church planting or who are asking, I want to, what church should I be a part of? What denomination, should I be a part of? A couple things. One is polity does matter, and tradition matters when it comes to polity. Obviously, I would say
Mhm.
Scripture gives us the basic outline, kind of the skeletal structure of a polity. We see that there are, for example, pastors,
Yeah.
elders, and deacons. We see that there are to be, presbyteries and councils, above the local church. We see a number of things in Scripture where you could say God's given us the basic outline of a polity. We've still got to fill it in. We've got to put flesh on those bones, but the skeleton of it is there in Scripture, and it goes back to the Old Covenant. I actually just preached on Exodus 18 this last week, and I talked about Jethro the Presbyterian, because I won't say that Jethro invented Presbyterianism in Exodus 18, but that's basically what you're getting.
You
Um,
Presbyterians are so committed to being Presbyterians. I
we
love it.
are. We
It's
are absolutely committed to it. But what I tell people, I think some people think that church government it's so mundane to talk about these kind of matters. Does it really matter how we set things up? I tell people, look, when you hold in your hands say a Presbyterian book of church order, you're holding in your hands the wisdom of the generations. You're holding in your
Mhm.
hands the fruit of generations of struggle and trial and error that produced that book of church order that you're holding in your hand. Because you know, to me, I think what happens with in a lot of situations, and Acts 29 is a good example of this, and sometimes I think you can see this in the Series C. There's an attempt to reinvent the wheel. And well,
Yeah.
we know better. We can start from scratch and come up with something better. And you realize really you can't.
Mhm.
I joke that Presbyterianism is the worst form of church government there is, except for all the others. Um, and I think that's true. I mean, it's never going to be implemented perfectly, but I think the principles that are there are biblical, and I think they're significant. I think they're helpful. I think what happened with you is a good example of how things can go wrong when there's not a a biblically shaped, and I would even say shaped by tradition, polity in place, to deal with conflict when it arises. So that's one thing. But then the other thing is even if you had a perfect church constitution, even if you had a divinely inspired book of church order, it is not going to do you any good unless the men who implement that system are godly men. So the polity on the page does matter. The character of the men implementing it matters even more. Both of those things are important, and I think in a lot of cases, they stand or fall together. I can imagine situations where maybe you have godly men who have a very imperfect system, and because they're so godly, it kind of covers for the flaws within the system.
Yeah.
But those things ought to go together. Godly men with a biblical system of government, that's your best bet for denominational longevity. And for avoiding unnecessary conflicts, being able to resolve conflict when it does happen, and all of that really does matter. It's so easy for us sometimes in our rush to plant churches or start something new, or to in a good way want to further say the mission of the church at large, to rush ahead with these things and leave behind polity, and in some cases even leave behind the importance of character. I mean, the one thing you see very clearly spelled out, and this is in Exodus 18. Jethro doesn't just give Moses a system of polity, basically a book of church order. He also gives to Moses the criteria or the qualifications that men must meet in order to be officers within that system. And again, both matter. It's got to be both. And when there's a breakdown in one or the other, it can really lead to disaster.
Yeah.
It's good. Yeah, I think another thing to say that's important is, the church is a divine institution, and it will, and the gates of hell will not prevail against her. But denominations are human institutions, and they will fail. They will ultimately fail, and so we Presbyterians love our Presbyterian polity. We CREC guys are all about. We're excited about where we're at, but we know that that they're not infallible, and they're susceptible because they're made up of humans and established by humans, that they're prone to the same weakness that we all are, and when they fail, we hope that godly men will walk away from them. We'll either fight and go down with the ship fighting to preserve them, or we'll know when it is to abandon them and walk away and let them burn.
I think that's right. And so, again, what we're seeing and what we've seen for a long time now is all of these Christian denominations and Christian institutions, because it's not just the denominations, it's not just the churches. We've seen it with Christian schools, we've seen it with Christian colleges and universities, we've seen it with parachurch ministries. They get hijacked by some, anti-biblical movement, which often parades itself as being compassionate or just or winsome or what have you, but it's contrary to the scriptures. But still, the institution gets hijacked, and so again, I think it comes back to having men who are willing to stand their ground, who are willing to be courageous, who are willing to speak for truth, and quite honestly, carry out the right kind of discipline. Now, Matt, in your case, you're on the wrong end of this, and I think it's really unfortunate, and I think it really it does not bode well for the future of Acts 29. I mean, I would just say that when an organization like Acts 29 starts to kick out good men like yourself, that's a sign that things are really headed in the wrong direction. But the flip side of that is that when organizations or institutions or denominations don't deal with snakes in the garden, or wolves that have gotten into the sheep pen, then that's a real problem. Yeah. And so there's got to be that disciplinary process too.
Yeah, and I think for us, and when I say us, I mean our elders at our church, Chase and I, a lot of guys have been like, man, you and Chase seem like you've been on several podcasts and you've been outspoken, and I think we have, but not as much as we could. We tried to be discerning, but the question is why. And at the end of the phone call when we were removed, I told those men on the call, I said, what you've done here today is wrong. And I believe it to be sinful, and this isn't good. And I said, I'm still trying to honor you as Christian men. And I said, what should I say? And they said, say whatever you want and tell whoever you want. And I said, well, then I will, because I think this is wrong, and I don't want other men to experience this or be harmed. And again, no victim. We understood what we were doing. And,
Yeah.
and a guy who was a prominent leader in the network called me up at the end when I was trying to discern. I was praying through, what do I do with this? Do I just go on my own way? Like you could just kind of go, I'm going to take the high road and I'm just going to work on my local church and not talk about these things and just focus at home. That would be easier, right? And I was talking with him, and he said he's one of the smartest guys I know, and he out of nowhere on the phone call goes, Matt, do you know how the French Revolution ended? And I said, I have no idea, man. And he goes, well, for a long time when people were being led to the guillotine, they were quiet. They took the high road. They took their punishment, and they thought that would change things, that would make it better. But it wasn't until they decided to start screaming and yelling what was wrong as they were led to the guillotine that people started looking around going, oh, this is bad. We shouldn't be doing this. And I said, so what are you saying? He said, start screaming when you're being headed to the guillotine. And I said, okay, man. And so that's dramatic. I know, which is part of my personality, but it is that kind of thing where we have to talk about these things, and men doing this hard work of church planting and leading churches, all these things we've talked about, whether it's polity and so on and so forth, we need to say these things. The reality is that the head of Acts 29, Brian Howard, once told me that if you want to look at how to not run a church from a ecclesiological kind of system, how to not do it, look at an Acts 29 church. And that's a problem, and that's not being addressed.
Yeah. Well, I want to kind of wrap things up here, because I know it's been about an hour, and for the sake of our, I don't want to get accused of false advertising with our podcast title being "God a Minute," but I've described, as I've tried to understand Acts 29, and what they are. I've thought of it as Southern Baptist with skinny jeans. It's like Southern Baptist, but like cooler jargon and marketing. And one of the dangers I think that we're seeing as we're talking about this is that kind of the innovation and the coolness, in Acts 29. Part of that is who was it that said, Rich, that the battle, the culture wars are basically a fight over, who gets to control the dictionary?
Well, I know Wilson has said it. I don't know.
Yeah, I know Doug said it a bunch of times.
Yeah,
maybe it's him.
Before him.
Yeah, well, I think what's happened is in an effort to be relevant and cool and different, they've defined their own terms, missional and gospel centered, and some of these terms that jargon that you guys use. The problem is that they're their own words, and they can kind of fill them with whatever meaning they want to, and so they sound biblical and they sound legitimate, but as they start applying them over time, because they're controlling the language, they're controlling the definitions of these words, they get to kind of move the goalposts over time to where missional used to mean leading people to repent of their sin and come to Jesus, right? And it's become compromise more and more with the culture so that you can be relevant. And how did that happen? Well, it happened because they defined words, and they get to control the definition of those words. So anyway, I thought that was a worthwhile point to bring up, and you're welcome to respond to that before we wrap up. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to make very clear that I've never worn skinny jeans.
Okay, good.
If here's anything on this podcast, I have never owned a pair of skinny jeans. I'm a firm believer. I prefer wearing cowboy boots, and if your boots are tight and they're not long, if your pants are tight and not long enough to go around the boots, you should not be wearing those pants.
Amen,
so
brother.
just
Amen.
clarification on that there. But yeah, it is true. And at the end of the day, I think You hit the nail on the head. We are trying to define and create new things, and
Yeah.
that's just not needed. It's not
Yeah.
needed. It's already been done.
Yeah.
Great men have come before us who've done the hard work of defining these things. Whether you start in the patristic era, with the Christological controversy and all of these things, that work's been done. Those terms and definitions are there, and we
Yeah.
need to be informing church planners as to that reality. And
Yeah.
what we're doing is it feeds into this thing. This is a greater thing. So if you're looking at any denomination, any network, anything like that, well, why are so many men burning out? It's because they feel like they have to be innovative all the time, and they get on this kind of like this, hamster wheel of I have to create the next best thing week in, week out, week in, week out. We have got to create a new ministry. And I joke and I tell pastors all the time coming to Boulder, I was like, if I was planting again, man, we'd have very simple music. We would, Sunday school. I mean, I'd almost go as back because it's just exhausting. And I'm afraid that we're wearing our men down with this innovation idea. And we don't have to do that. And then we get in trouble when we start creating these new structures, and particularly when we create them without proper oversight. That's where I think Acts 29's made its kind of fatal flaw. And that stems from it. If you want to know how things are developed, you look back to the beginning with Driscoll early on saying denominations are dead and networks are the future. Mm-hmm. And look at us now. I mean, time proves what is true. Yeah.
Well, that's probably a good place to stop, Matt. I know that this has been I'm sure a difficult time for you, but also an opportunity to learn, to grow, and I'm encouraged to hear you think through these things and to see how this is steering you perhaps back to old roads, returning to old roads, returning to Scripture, returning to the men of the faith who have come before us and have done the work, to help guide and direct the church towards faithfulness to her King. And so I'm excited about this opportunity. I think that lays before you and the well there in Boulder. I think you guys are probably on the cusp of an exciting new era for the church, and I pray that God would bless you guys as you navigate that.
Thanks, man. We appreciate it. We'll take all the prayers and that we can get. So,
well, thanks for coming on the show, and thanks for joining us here on God a Minute. It's been a fun hour. If people want to find you, I know that your co-pastor Chase had a conversation on a podcast. I think that was Conversations That Matter. Is that right?
Yeah, he did.
And then how do people find you guys? And if you're in the Boulder area and you're looking for a church that's been recently kicked out of Acts 29, where should they find you?
Yeah, if you want to run with a bunch of renegades, you can find it. Just go to our website. It's just boulderwell.org. You can go there.
Awesome.
You can find us there. You can hit me up on social media. All my handles are just MattPat1. My name's Matt Patrick, so MattPat1, and shoot me a message. I'm happy to help you even find a good church if you're looking for one. We've got a lot of friends in the church planning world that are doing great things, and so happy to help people any way that I can.
That's great, man. Well, I said this to you on the phone the other day. I think the Lord's going to expect you to return a profit on this, and I think part of that, a big part of that's going to be your sort of God has basically given you the responsibility of helping others who are having these same difficulties and challenges and questions. You're kind of the guy right now for them to come talk to and think through all this stuff with. So I'm sure you're going to have a lot of work to do there, but excited for you, man.
Thanks. Yeah, and if any guys ever are interested in planting in Colorado, we've got a great training residency program, and that's our focus right now. Is not big, just focusing on planting great churches. Hopefully starting schools, all that good stuff across the state of Colorado. So we'd be happy to help anybody.
Praise God.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we'll talk to you guys later. Good having you on the show.
Thanks, guys.
The God a Minute podcast is a ministry of Trinity Reformed Church in Huntsville, Alabama. If you enjoyed this podcast, you might also like the Good Life podcast, where Matt Carpenter interviews historians, philosophers, authors, and more about how their work contributes to a good life.